button. So let's get that rolling. Okay. And I do presume you all can see my screen. It looks like it's working. If not, you can let me know. But today, I broke this down into 4 sections. We'll start really, really basic, just what are reserves. If you've dealt with a reserve study, if you've been in this industry for long at all, you're probably very familiar with this. But either way, I never know who's sitting in on these webinars. So we're going to start there. And then we'll go a little deeper in actually what is a reserve study? What are the different components? What goes into it? And then the second part, the last 2 points here are really specific, for managers of, okay, how do you facilitate a reserve study being performed? Like what are steps you can take to help facilitate that process to get the absolute best end result for your client, for the association? And then once that's been accomplished, okay, how do we interpret this? How do we read this study? How do we extract more from it than just what do we need to budget in reserves next year? And that whole topic of how to interpret, there's another course, a whole hour course that's really focused around that. So we're going to touch on that. We won't go absolutely too far into the weeds there, but there's a lot we can learn from that section. So that's what we'll cover today. First section, what are reserves at the very, very basic level? Simply put, reserve funds are funds or monies that are specifically allocated for specific projects, and those projects need to be capital repair replacement projects of elements that are responsibility or maintained or owned by the association, right? Very simple process. Again, anyone who's been in this industry, not telling you anything new there. Important thing to look at with that statement, though, is it's something that's owned or maintained by the association. And also, if you've been in the industry for a while, you've probably come across where that's not black and white. That's not crystal clear. There's some things that are simple and easy to understand. If it's an HOA, the clubhouse is the HOAs. There's not a lot of ambiguity there. But sticking with an HOA, fence on the west perimeter of the property. Sometimes we struggle to know who owns that. Or if we think about the condominium world, who owns these windows and doors? Is it the unit owner or is it the association? So to answer that question, we're going to look in a few different areas. First and foremost, we're going to say, well, we need to look at the governing docs, the CC&Rs. In the condo world, we're going to get a lot more definition just by nature of how condominiums are structured. In terms of what's common, what's limited common, what's owner maintained. But when we look over on the HOA side, you're not going to get a whole lot. I mean, I've personally been doing this 7 years, a little over 7 years, and I don't think I've ever come across governing docs that clearly said every element that's common. It's a lot less detailed out there, but we always need to start there. Those are the legal documents that are giving us that guidance. But with that and their legal documents, there's plenty of ambiguity. Sometimes we may feel one section says one thing and another says another. And that's where reserve specialist is always going to say, I'm not a lawyer. You need to get some input from your legal guidance on that. So always when there's ambiguity or confusion or it's contested, that's where you need legal input. And then certainly a reserve specialist is going to follow whatever guidance that you or the association may have received. And then finally, I put this in here, and I'll mention this a couple of times, there's gray area. In reserve studies, we try to be black and white, but it's not always the case. So there's this gray area I like to touch on here, and I'm calling it historical practice. The example I always use on this one is an HOA. Let's say they've been around 20 years, and they paint all the fences in the community, at the lots, everything. They paint them every 5 years. Now we look at the plats, and it's really clear that these fences are each individual unit owners. As a reserve specialist coming into that property, again, this hypothetical is, and I've had a property like this, but this hypothetical, it's been around for 20 years. I or whoever the reserve specialist is, we don't know what has transpired in those 20 years. There may have been a vote, a board resolution that actually made that the painting the actual responsibility of the association. Don't know exactly how we got to this point, but if there's in essence this precedent, even though maybe it's not owned by the association. The governing docs aren't speaking to it, but there's this precedent. Many times we're going to follow that and saying, okay, that's association maintained. Again, entirely letter of the law, is it the association's responsibility? Could be, maybe not. But we want to make a study that's useful. And look, if this association has been doing this and they're going to continue doing it and it's not inappropriate, it doesn't appear inappropriate, we'd likely need to include that in the study. So that's sort of the three areas I'm saying that capture this concept of association maintained. And so if it's association maintained, it's a capital project, that's a qualified reserve component. That's something that's going to be captured in a reserve study. One additional point, and this really speaks to the condominium side of things, is common elements versus limited common. And what I want to point out here is that classification in and of itself is really just a use classification. By itself, it doesn't tell us maintenance. And what I mean by that is the most common are balconies. Almost always a balcony at a condo is going to be classified as limited common element. If you read the definitions here, it's because you don't want all your neighbors to have the legal right to hop on your balcony. The same way you and all your neighbors have your legal right to go to the pool. The pool is a general common element, but your balcony is 99.9% of the time going to be limited common. So that, again, is just a use restriction. Later in the docs is where you almost always will then find the maintenance responsibility of the various limited common elements. And I bring this up because I've worked with clients, balconies are limited common. I've worked with clients where the maintenance responsibility is 100% association. I've worked with clients where some aspects of it are association, some are homeowner. So walking into a community and I hear, well, that's limited common element, the association doesn't have to worry about it. While that may be true, we just always want to make sure we dig further. So I've seen associations trip up on that. So I always like to use this as an opportunity to drive home that point. You really need to investigate further and not just stop at that classification of a limited common element. And so again, that was very basic. Got through that first section pretty quickly. We'll now look at actually the reserve study itself. You know, what is it? What are the pieces of it? What's it look like? So first, we're going to look at what we call the CAI four-part test. The reason it's sort of casually referred to that, some people call it the National Reserve Study Standards, which that's what it is. Well, it's all developed by CAI. And what they said in the list of standards, there's a whole host of things that must be part of a reserve study that qualify it, that make a document, right, an actual reserve study. But a big part of it circles around these four sections. And what we're outlining here is an element or an expenditure needs to satisfy all four of these requirements to be considered or to be included in the reserve study. So it's a good way to every reserve specialist is going through this, but even you or your board members, when you start to talk about things, or maybe you have a study and you're saying, why isn't X in here? And there could be other reasons too, why it's not in there. But first you want to look here. If it's not meeting these realistically, it's not going to be in there. And the first is what I sort of started with. It has to be association maintained. There's gray area there, but that's very important. And another way to look at that is plenty of communities will manage projects on behalf of the homeowners, meaning I've worked with communities where the association actually contracts and manages painting of the single family homes. They do it all at once or, in phases. The association, through a single contract, you get way better pricing and you maintain aesthetic continuity. Lots of times this is age restricted communities, but nonetheless, they'll then actually directly bill that back to the homeowner. So I call it a pass-through cost. It's not actually association responsibility. So if we have something like that, or maybe the example I used earlier, the fence painting, maybe it actually falls in that category. If we're just passing through, we don't want that in the study. And certainly we don't want anything that's not association maintained. HOA, if the sidewalks in front of a unit or a home, are actually going to be maintained by the unit owners, we don't want to account for that in the reserve study. Like, it's not an expense the association has to bear. So it's obviously number one, it's where you have to start. The next two sort of qualifiers of this four-part test both relate to useful life. So I'll show both. First, we're saying limited useful life as well as a predictable remaining useful life. So limited useful life means just that it's limited to the scope of the study. A reserve study at minimum has to be 20 years in timeline. Almost every reserve study you receive now is going to be a 30-year study. Almost everyone, every provider is doing that. So if I come to your property, it's a brand new HOA, and the subsurface piping is a common element. It's private, it's owned by the association in this scenario. It meets that first test, but it fails number two. The life of that piping, 70, 80, 90 years, that is beyond the scope of the study. So that's a case where you may look at the study and say, oh, you guys forgot to include this because it's a common element. You're right, it's a common element, but a study only captures expenditures within that scope of time frame. 30 years is enough time that it gives you enough years to fund up for it. So if we're thinking of an expense 50, 60, 70 years down the road, we don't start funding for those typically till they come into that scope of the reserve study, that 30-year timeline. Then the third item, which relates to useful life as well, stated here on the screen, we need a predictable remaining life. And so predictable meaning that it's not volatile, it's not sporadic, that a reserve specialist can adequately, with good level of accuracy, predict the expense will occur. So we look at the common things you see in a study. If it's a condo, we have a pretty good handle on roof lives, of painting, of siding, of pavement. There's a lot of good data, known information on the lifespan of that. Some would argue, if we want to say, well, what's not predictable? Potentially piping failure. Some providers are going to say it's so sporadic and volatile in nature, we can't pinpoint, oh, you're going to replace all your piping at 70 years. So maybe you would see that excluded. So it has to be somewhat predictable. And I say somewhat because we always have to bear in mind a reserve study, remember, covering 30 years, it's a projection. And like in any industry, it's setting you on a path, but it's not, 100% accurate. It's impossible to be 100% sure that 22 years from now, you're going to spend exactly $440,000 on a roof. It's getting you in that right direction. But that's all I mean by relatively predictable. And the final part of this four-part test is this concept of a minimum threshold. What this is accomplishing is it's the dollar amount of this minimum threshold is specific to each community. So a huge HOA that has a $3 million annual budget, the threshold is going to be higher than the small 60-home HOA that has a $40,000 annual budget. But respective to each community, it's this concept of a minimum threshold keeps very minor nominal expenditures out of the reserve study because one, first and foremost, it's going to sort of bloat the study, not the funding realistically, but the actual line items and what's being discussed, and focus is going to be spent on too many areas. It's trying to narrow it in. And again, this is a very low amount. We're not cutting out a ton of expenses, but it's meant to be very nominal expenditures not being captured. A $300 valve replacement for a high rise. Yes, that's a common element, but we have, multi-million-dollar projects for this high rise. We don't need a line item for this single valve. So that's the concept of sort of drawing a floor and saying expenditures below this, we're not going to capture in our reserve funding. So that's the four-part test. If we have a project and expenditure and it meets all four criteria, then yeah, likely or almost certainly you should see that in the reserve study. Now that we've talked about what an expenditure needs to pass to then be included in the study, let's look at the actual study itself and how that breaks down and what the different pieces of that are. So at the highest level, you're almost always going to hear a provider explain that a reserve study has two parts. There's the physical evaluation, and then there's the financial analysis. Okay, and combining, once both those are accomplished, the whole intent of a reserve study, right? Initially, many of us would think, well, it's to know what to budget in reserves. Well, yes, but more specifically, it's this concept of adequate funding. And to define that a little more, I'm going to say relatively stable, equitable funding while minimizing risk of special assessment. We'll see a chart later on that visually explains this, but as you can imagine, you probably are aware that year to year, your expenditures from reserves fluctuate significantly. I mean, one year you may repave the roads for a couple $1,000,000. The next year you may have one or two $10,000 expenses out of your reserve account. Just the way the scheduling works out. However, the contribution side, no association can weather huge swings in that. So that's where the funding is relatively stable, right? We don't see these huge fluctuations in contributions in, even though expenses out may be significantly changing year to year. And with that relatively stable contribution in, the goal, right, is that we are doing everything in our power to minimize the risk of special assessment. Certainly, there's no way to guarantee it. And this is all about probable aging of infrastructure. A reserve study isn't preparing us for a hurricane or flooding or anything of that magnitude. We're talking about the normal expiration, of roofs or of paving. But once you are set up on that funding guidance, you're really in this position where your risk of special assessment is very, very low. So the first piece, right, there's physical evaluation and financial analysis. That first piece, the physical evaluation, this is the on-site, right, the physical work that goes in with a reserve study. And I break that down further into two main components, both occurring on site. We have a meeting, and then we have the actual inspection itself. So to look at that meeting, what that is, what the purpose of that is. So that meeting, that's between the reserve specialist and what I'm right now calling community stakeholders. We'll define that a little bit later. But that meeting, what is being discussed? What is the purpose? What is the necessity of this meeting? First and foremost, it keeps coming back to this is the moment really where a reserve specialist is clearly understanding and talking through with these stakeholders the responsibility. Certainly before this meeting, the specialist will likely have received your governing docs, done I'll call it a high level review of those, and have some general idea and assumptions of what should or likely be responsibility of the association. But it's through this on-site meeting, this discussion, that the reserve specialist is clearly understanding and identifying what components are going to be included and what are going to be excluded. And certainly, myself, this is the meeting where at times I've looked through those docs and I'm saying let's say this is a condo. I look at them and I'm saying, yeah, these windows and doors, every window and door on this condo, association responsibility. That's what I think the documents clearly say. But I meet with you and the board and you're informing me, hey, no, we really don't think that. Well, that's a great discussion to have. And if we're really that conflicted, I'm going to, like I said earlier, I'm going to strongly encourage getting a legal opinion. Or maybe you already have it. I thought it would be included. You say, no, we've actually already gone through this discussion. And then you're able to give me some of that, or the provider who you're working with, you're able to give them some of that documentation. Again, clearly understanding that scope of responsibility. You get that wrong, sticking with this example, and we include the entire building's windows and doors. That's almost all, depending on building size, but generally that's multi-million-dollar projects. We include that in a study when it shouldn't. I mean, at that point, the study, until you revise it, is worthless. It's very incorrect. So that's critically important. After that, though, there's still more information at this meeting, and the more we get, the more accurate the study is going to be. And so now we're going to look at history. If it's a brand new community, probably a really quick conversation. Everything's brand new, no issues, nothing's happened. But for every other community out there, if it's been around 5 years or 50 years, what is the history? What have we done? What significant projects have occurred? Now, if it's a 50-year-old community, a reserve specialist isn't trying to understand every dollar spent from reserves over that timeline, right? We're looking at big capital projects, anything that you or the board is aware of or has records on. That's what the reserve specialist is wanting to get their hands on. Because I always explain it as sort of this spectrum of And I've done a study, I'd say almost everywhere in the spectrum, where there's no history. Boards knew, they had horrible records. Management company just took over. There's realistically no good historical information. That's fine. You can reserve specialists can conduct a reserve study, and it's still it's valid. It's usable, but it's down here as the lowest level of detail. And then we can go all the way to the other end where you have extreme good detailed information. It's understandable. We know what it's talking about. Lots of good historical information. Well, that's just going to increase the accuracy of a study. And so just gleaning and getting that information is another key step of this meeting. And finally, I put it on here, a review of the operating budget. I'm always going to explain this as a reserve specialist is really focused on that one number. It's going to provide the reserve funding. So it's not that reserve specialist is doing an analysis of your entire budget and opining on it, but this is more about what I call shortfalls and double funding. The example I use here would be pool furniture. About half the communities I work with fund that from reserves, and about half fund that from operating. Either is fine, right? As long as they're properly planning for it, it's perfectly fine to fund it in either location. But if I don't look at the budget and I presume that this community is funding it from operating, so I don't include it in the reserve study, now you're not funding for it anywhere. So that's a big mess up. But the opposite is also a problem. If I include it in the study and I didn't take a moment to realize you're also funding it on an ongoing replacement basis through operating, you're now actually carrying the cost or the funding of that in two locations. So you're elevating the funding requirements and you're actually charging a higher total assessment than necessary. So it's that concept of making sure we don't double up or actually have a shortfall. And pool furniture is one of the common ones, but there's plenty of other expenditures that we do see sometimes handled through operating funds. So we want to make sure that where the funds need to be accounted for. Now, the inspection side of that, I have a number of points here, and I'm going to use probably examples on most of these. So this is now your reserve specialist completes the meeting and now is actually doing the inspection. So first and foremost, well, what is the purpose of this? Reserve specialist needs to figure out your quantities. How much pavement exists. What are the total number and sizes of windows and doors? You need to know the quantity of all these elements. And then equally as important is, well, what is the condition? Because it's great that you know how many windows and doors there are and they're 20 years old, but what's their condition? Do they have another 20 years of life? Do they only have 5? So that's obviously where the starting point, bare minimum, that has to occur. But a good reserve specialist has to go a lot further than that, right? To get us on that spectrum of detail, we want to get as close as we can to that high level, that great reserve study. Things to consider that the reserve specialist should be looking at. Manners of replacement. What do I mean by this? Let's think of concrete flat work, sidewalks through the whole community. I've yet to ever come across a community that, at 60 or 65 years of age said, all right, we're ripping up all our sidewalks and we're replacing our sidewalks. That's just not what happens. We see really, really small percentages replaced every so many years. Well, during that inspection is when a specialist can figure out what makes sense, what replacement timing makes sense. Is it 5% of the sidewalks every 10 years? Maybe is a lower percentage more frequently, based on that condition. So how are we going to piecemeal that type of a project? Or on the other end, let's talk about asphalt pavement. Huge HOA, 5 miles of streets. There's a good chance we don't just repave all those in 1 year. That may have to get phased out over numerous years. That could simply be because the community was built out over a decade, and some pavement is only a year old and some's already 10 years old. Related to that or not related to a big build out, you could just have various conditions. Lots of times you'll see, main thoroughfares have more wear than some lateral streets that only serve 10 homes, right? Collector roads probably are wearing faster. Maybe those need repaving at a slightly accelerated cycling, every 15 years, but those side streets are every 20. So that type of a determination, manner of replacement, has to be evaluated. I have on here factors affecting replacement cost. Best example for this is if we think of two communities that both have 1,000 linear feet of wood fence, exact same wood fence. On paper, you would say, well, 1,000 linear feet times $30 a linear foot, you would think that they both have the same cost. However, community A, it is 1,000 feet on the west perimeter in the middle of a field, so extremely easy to replace. A contractor can do that at a pretty low unit cost. But community B, again, 1,000 linear feet, but it's 100 locations of 10-foot sections. And maybe they're, hiding the condensing units behind each home, and it's really hard to access, right? It's 100 different locations. The unit cost, cost per linear foot of that fence is going to be way higher. So again, on paper, you may say, okay, I can just multiply quantity times unit cost and roll with that, but you really can't. That's something that has to be evaluated during the inspection. And then finally, prioritization. Best case scenario is no prioritization has to occur, meaning it's a new community, everything's in great condition, or even if it's an older community, and there's various stages of condition, but if they're well funded, they're on track, we don't have to prioritize. We get to do everything when it needs to be accomplished. The reality is, myself and our company doing this close to 30 years, I want to say the bulk of communities are slightly to significantly underfunded. And so there is this element of prioritization. I personally have gone to a community that needs new roofs, new paving, they need to replace siding on their buildings, pool plaster, clubhouse, just everything, or what feels like everything is in disrepair. The reality is a funding plan is not going to work. You can't say do all that. One, just financially, they're not going to be able to weather that. And two, logistically, I don't think any manager would want to handle that many large capital projects at once. So it's this element of prioritization would come into play. You'll probably need to do the roofs before the pool. And then the clubhouse renovation, honestly, you're just going to have to live with that dated clubhouse, right? That's not critical. So at times prioritization will come into the picture. So that was the physical evaluation. That other side, right, of the study is the financial analysis. And this maybe at times surprises folks, but this is the easy part. And we'll look at a funding plan that sort of substantiates that statement. But all it really is what do you have in the bank? What's our starting point, and what are we spending each year, and running that iterative analysis with a couple other points over the next 30 years, and determining, well, how much needs to go in so you always have money, right? It's a very iterative, relatively basic calculation. All of the energy really is on that inspection, and from that inspection, developing the expenditures. What are we spending and when? But once that's set, that financial analysis, right, that output, that's relatively a straightforward process. And I'll talk about that a little bit later, but to go and sort of preempt it here, the reason I want to paint that picture of the financial analysis, the funding plan, is sort of the simple aspect is most of the phone calls I've had after we've shipped a study, a board sees the funding plan, they don't like the funding, and they want to talk about the funding. And I get that. I'm a homeowner in an HOA. I don't want dues elevated, but that's the output, right? As a reserve specialist, I didn't pick that number because that's a good number. It's about the input, those expenditures, right? So understanding the financial analysis is sort of the final, it's the finish, it's the output. If there's concerns or questions, primarily, you need to look at the input. You need to look at those expenditures. And then finally, we've sort of hit on these. I'll really talk about the third one on here, though, is just to drive home, things that shouldn't be in the study. So first and foremost, homeowner maintained, not association, doesn't need to be in the study. Minor expenses, sort of already covered this with the 4-part test, the fourth one being the minimum threshold amount. But it's this last one on here I just want to touch on, what I'm calling general maintenance. I get this probably a lot more in the mid-rise, high-rise communities, but this question really can come from any community of, the reserve study, let's say it has the roof. It doesn't matter if it's the clubhouse, pool house roof, or the building, the condominium or high-rise roof. The reserve study typically is simply going to be the replacement of that roof. So I'll get a call and say, hey, we need to do a repair to the roof. Can we spend reserve funds on that? And that can get into a lengthy conversation. But generally speaking, I'm going to explain, well, the reserve study, you'll look at the schedule of expenditures. If it's not clearly on there, the reserve funding is not accounting for it, meaning the reserve study has the, let's call it $1 million roof replacement, but it doesn't have repairs here and there. So that general maintenance, or maybe even preventative maintenance, that's not what a reserve study is setting you up for. That's critically important. General maintenance, and even better, preventative maintenance, inspections, catching things before they become bigger problems. Those are critical things to be done, but that's not what the reserve study is giving you the guidance for. And if you don't do those things, we're probably not going to get the lifespan that we are anticipating in the reserve study. But understanding there's sort of this separation, those are important tasks and important dollars to be spent, but for the most part, that's not what's being captured in the reserve study. So I always just like to talk to that. And then finally here, these are just examples that I have, but this concept of some overlooked components, I put this in here because this more often comes from when I'm working directly with a board, lots of times maybe even a self-managed board. But regardless, where they're saying, oh, hey, I know what we have. We have roofs, we have pavement, we have a good handle on this, but they've done the right thing and they're getting a professional study. That's a great decision for them to make. But what I find is they think they have everything captured. They have their 3 or 5 or 7 line items or expenditures. By the time you get a reserve study, likely from any provider, you're going to see a lot more expenditures captured in there. And that really comes down to primarily, I would say, the examples I have on here are mostly elements with long lifespan. So it's something that feels like that lasts forever, or maybe you don't really understand it. Here in Texas, these stormwater management systems, they look just like some dry dirt. They're actually engineered systems. You actually need to rework those. Those are about 25 to 35 year lifespan. Light poles and fixtures, Finch Creek, precast walls, things that, to what I would say a layperson, you think that lasts forever. Well, let's think through this. We do a 30-year study. If the community was built in 1970, we're already at, now 50 years of age. So that's going to be 80 years by the end of the study. It's just this concept, very few things last forever. So it's easy to overlook expenditures. And with that, moving into the third section, more specific to managers, okay, that we were covering just the reserve study itself. Looking at here, as a manager, how do you facilitate the reserve study? Like, what are steps that you take? And first and foremost, what we request, and I suspect almost every reserve study provider is going to request, it's going to be similar to what I'm listing here on the screen. First and foremost, financial information. Without this, you can't actually complete the reserve study, because that last piece I was talking about, right, the financial analysis, we don't know what you have in the bank, and we don't know what you're contributing this year. So critically important that you provide that information to the reserve specialist, even if it's projected. Sometimes there's a lot going on and we just need to project it. We expect in the year at 400,000. As long as you can communicate with your reserve specialist, some amount has to be understood. That's that starting point, the stepping off point. So just trying to drive home the point. That's near and dear to me. I actually currently have a job that I'm still waiting on. I mean, it's a very common struggling point. Almost as critically important are those CC&Rs, the declarations, bylaws, governing documents. I've said a reserve specialist, is not a legal expert. We're not going to legally opine on anything. But when there's those questions, if your reserve specialist does have those documents on hand, they are all of us are familiar with these, and we can at least be another voice giving some input. And so it is really, really helpful to provide those to your reserve specialist. Not absolutely critical, but extremely helpful. And similar to what I covered earlier is prior to the study, prior to the inspection and that meeting occurring between you and a reserve specialist, any information on capital projects is going to be helpful, going to get us on that spectrum to the more detailed, more accurate study. What I'm not saying here, I understand, especially portfolio managers, but all managers, time is limited. I don't feel there's enough. And we're not saying go to your offsite storage, pull 10 banker boxes down and look through years and years of records. That's not at all what I think any reserve specialist is asking for. But let's say you just did a elevator modernization a few years back. If you can find any supporting documents on that, that's helpful. Maybe it's just an email where we see the total project cost, or maybe it's the bid or actually some of the contract docs that spell out more details of what the project entailed. Those large dollar capital expenditures in the last number of years, that's super helpful to get a more accurate study. And then even projects that are planned. If a community knows, hey, we're planning to repave next year, we've already started collecting some preliminary bids, that's going to be very, very helpful. If you have some scope understanding of project cost and timing, you want to incorporate that into a study. So critically important. And then finally, on that financial side, we do account for, and you'll see this when I show a funding plan, we do account for return on investment. So if you do want to share, the board wants to share what type of rate of return you're getting, that's helpful because that rate of return, that income from interest, that does very slightly offset the funding need. So it's an important number. It's not huge and significant, but again, it still offsets funding slightly. So it's important. Now, again, looking at that study, I said there's the physical and the financial. So as a manager on that physical evaluation, that meeting, well, how do you best facilitate that? So this is really more of an opportunity for me to give you what I say sort of some FYIs as managers. If you've never worked with a provider for a study, or maybe once and it was years ago, I think it's good to just understand the average community. Of course, there's outliers, but the average community, you're looking at a single day inspection with that meeting starting at the beginning of the day, most likely. And realistically, it's an hour or less. I mean, I've had plenty that go longer, but if we want to talk averages, that's about the time investment that's really needed from you as a manager. Something to think about is, after that inspection, the one sort of key thing, I don't list that anywhere here, is depending on the community type, the reserve specialist needs to get potentially into some restricted access places. If this is a high rise, you have an on-site building engineer, it's probably going to be the reserve specialist walking with that individual to get to the roof and mechanical rooms. But if this is just an HOA, it's probably as simple as you letting the reserve specialist into the pump room for the pool, maybe the restroom facilities. Just being aware, that is a little bit of extra time that's needed from you as a manager. But that meeting, I also have mentioned earlier, that whole community stakeholders, and I said I would define what that means. So first and foremost, a reserve specialist is almost always working with you, the managers, but board members, of course, are invited and allowed to participate in this if they have a desire to, and it can actually be helpful. Many times a manager tells me, hey, I just started managing this association, to no fault of your own, you more or less know nothing about it. So that meeting, if I just meet with you, it's going to be really short, which is fine. But if you have board president Bob, who's been there forever, or maybe a past board president, that the current board says, yes, it's okay for him to meet with you, maybe that individual is one who's providing a lot of that historical information. So anyone who can really provide some of that context, that's going to be helpful. Again, getting us on that spectrum closer to the more detailed, more accurate study. And then bear in mind, if I'm there with you, I'm going to be asking tons and tons of questions, right? That's the whole point, is the reserve specialist to learn as much as they can about this community. But this is a great opportunity for you as a manager or your board members to ask questions of the reserve specialist. I think it's a great opportunity. I love face-to-face interactions. We're not doing those these days, but soon enough we'll be back to that, I think, and it's easier to communicate in that platform. So any questions you have or your board has, that's just a really good opportunity to discuss those. And then the actual inspection. So, how are you facilitating that? I already mentioned, access to locked spaces, but there's a few other, what I say are FYIs. One is notify residents. This is more a plea on my behalf. The number of times I'm walking behind homes and between buildings, and homeowners get a little scared or confused. It can be helpful just to let them know, hey, we're going to have an individual, walking the property, taking photos. They're going to be here a number of hours. It can really help maybe put homeowners at ease. And something to think about too is, certainly you have vendors on your properties all the time, but the landscapers are the landscapers. It's a very, common sight to see, and they're using their equipment. Hey, they're mowing, or they're putting new flowers in the flower beds, or the roofer is on site. He's going up to the roof. That's pretty straightforward. It's good to remember, a reserve specialist is literally covering your entire property, right? Because we talked about earlier, they're quantifying, condition assessing everything from the roof to the wall to the pavement to the clubhouse to the pool. So they're literally covering the whole property, which is quite different than most other vendors. So it's just nice to let your residents know that ahead of time. And then with those community stakeholders, board involvement, when they have known complaints or issues, hey, we're really worried about these balconies on this building, or we're really worried about this section of the perimeter wall, it's leaning. That's great, good information for them to point out or take the reserve specialist over to. But once they've been able to sort of show those pain points, you really want, and I mean, myself and I think all reserve specialists are going to try to let the board know that the reserve specialist needs to, on their own, after they've been given those pieces of information, they need to determine an unbiased opinion of conditions, what's important, what needs to be prioritized. So you do want sort of some separation there between the board giving that input and then the reserve specialist determining their overall findings on their own, unbiased. Finally, and wrapping this up here, we have, okay, how do we interpret the study? And I mentioned at the beginning, we have a whole hour presentation realistically just on this topic. So certainly I'm not going to go too detailed here. I think it's a really valuable topic, hence why we developed that other course. But we'll get into it briefly here. And this is something I'm always happy we can discuss, another time, or if you have specific questions, I can share my phone and email, and we can communicate that way. But you've done everything. You helped facilitate a great study. We had the meeting, we had the inspection. So what do? Like, we get a reserve study. How do we read it? And I think I've broken this down into 4 steps. And the first one to me makes sense. It's start at the beginning of that report. The executive summary in this and any technical document is just that. It's meant to be a concise, simple summarization of the findings of whatever this document is. So in this case, of the reserve study. I found that this will answer a good amount of the initial questions that you or a board may have. Certainly, it doesn't get into the weeds. It doesn't get all the way down into the smallest detail, but it really does answer a lot of those questions. When I field a phone call after I've issued a reserve study, I'm almost always starting here with, you, the manager, or the board on that call. And if need be, yeah, we'll dig further into the report. But I want to highlight just a few sections of this executive summary. And I know it may be small on your screen. As I said, I can share a couple documents just for your records if you need it, or if you want to share with board members or anybody else. But first and foremost, it's going to outline what is the funding goal of this study. And I actually talk about the goal first. You'll notice down below we have then the funding, because you have to understand, well, what is the goal? Because we're achieving that goal with the funding we recommend. And I'm going to actually read it real quickly here, but this explains that the funding goal is to maintain your reserves above an adequate, not excessive threshold. And it specifically for this example says that's in year 2026 due to asphalt pavement repaving. And so I want to start with the goal, because we'll actually go ahead and go down. I'm going to jump all the way, once my computer unfreezes, down to recommended funding. Okay, I went too far. Apologies. So if I go down to recommended funding, again, hard to read, but this community, they contribute $92,000 a year, and all that we're recommending is a really modest $3,500 increase. I've issued studies very similar to this, and boards and maybe even managers have had a hard time understanding, well, 92,000 seems like a good amount, and you're telling us to just barely adjust that to 95,000. That's why I start with the goal. Well, why is that the recommendation? Well, in this example, that goal relates to this year 2026 and asphalt pavement repaving. So stated another way, you can infer or understand, well, if you don't follow the guidance, you're probably going to run into an issue by 2026. You likely won't run into an issue next year or the year after for this community, but it's that goal, that critical year of 2026. If you don't follow the funding guidance, you're not going to achieve the goal. So I think it's important just to understand that, the goal, what are we funding for? We're funding for all of our expenditures, but there's typically almost every study, there's going to be a few years, one or maybe a few years of critical expenses. Our reserves are going to draw down significantly. And so that's the goal. That's controlling our funding. Again, there's a lot more in the executive summary, but I don't want to go too far into that right now. But that's always where I'd want you to start. And I always recommend when you get a study, of course, it's going to look different depending on the provider. But as far as I know, every provider has some form of an executive summary. Read that. It's going to be a couple pages. I understand you get a 70-page report. You don't have a lot of time. I mean, I wouldn't want to read it personally either. But read those first couple pages. And you'll actually learn a lot about it. And you probably can even answer at least some of the board questions. And I think anytime that you can assist the board there, that's going to elevate managers of your professionalism, your knowledge. By no means do you become the expert. The reserve specialist is the expert. You always want to defer to them. But anything, read that executive summary. You'll probably understand the findings of that report a lot more. But with that, the meat of the study is the actual expenditure tables, right? This is the 30-year of expenditures. There's a lot of data. It definitely looks very different depending on provider, but all the data is there. It's in essence the exact same information. It's just depicted differently. But understanding, once we've talked about the executive summary, this is likely what we're going to look at. And it's just an itemization of all of those components, the quantities, the cost, when we're going to do them. It shows you inflation. It's really all of the numbers that go into the study. Again, don't want to dive too deep into this. If we have some questions, we can circle back to that. But that's the meat of the report. That's really the output. Well, I say the funding plan is the output, but I guess they're married together. The expenditure sheets, and then the next one is the funding plan we'll look at. Like that's really what the reserve study is. Everything else then is supporting documentation to that. And so, as I said, the next step is that funding plan, married together. Once the expenditures have been determined and scheduled out, then we're going to look at the funding plan. And it's of course a 30-year timeline. But I think I have in here. Yeah. Okay. So this is the chart I referenced earlier, and this is you can't get the details from this. But if I back up, this isn't even the full funding plan. This just covers the first 8 or 9 years. So the funding plan, in a way, it's messy. There's a lot of numbers, and you obviously need to know the precise numbers. But even doing this day in, day out, if I look at a funding plan, I can't tell you the story realistically. And maybe this is just me because I'm visual, but if I look at this and being familiar with this example property, right, and if this was one of your properties you manage, you'd be familiar, you can understand that story a bit more. I think I can turn on my laser pointer. Yeah, so you should be able to see this. So if we remember back to that funding goal, we said it's in year 2026 for asphalt pavement repaving. So if we look, 2026 is around right here. And remember, the concept was our reserves are down at an adequate but not excessive threshold, meaning the reserve balance, this blue line, is really low. Like we're drawing down our reserves, and that's, as we talk about, because of asphalt pavement repaving. And because I'm familiar with this property, we actually realized we did roof replacements the 2 years prior. So we can just visually look and quickly see, okay, we've got couple of years of major expenditures. Let's go out about 20 more years. We're going to see that again, new roofs, new paving. And we notice in between there, years of significant reserve fund balances. And I always want to draw attention to that because we remember in this example, they contribute $92,000 a year. And we're saying that needs to go up about $3,500. And as a board member, I think they're definitely justified in questioning that. Like, why do we need to do that? And then they even find out they're barely spending anything those years. It's the totality of this. It's the full 30 years and how they all play together that if we ignore the funding guidance in the first couple years, once we get into these major projects, in this case, roof and paving, you're probably going to run out of money, right? So seeing how it all plays together, and then also seeing how if we take this, let's say this is light fixtures and we accelerate them a couple years out here, it doesn't matter. We can do that. You understand there's actually significant flexibility barring the couple of critically low threshold years. So just some points I like to emphasize there on the funding plan. And then finally, this is the biggest section of the report and absolutely the most neglected is the actual narratives. I said it earlier, I don't fault you or boards for not having a strong desire to read a 50, 70 page reserve study. However, if we read the executive summary and we answer a lot of our questions, but we probably still have some. And then we look at the expenditure tables and we learn a lot more. You still can't answer every question you have just by looking at those expenditure tables. Really, the last place to look, where you likely should be able to find the answer, is into those narratives. And so a few things to highlight here. First is just that concept, the detailed information is going to live in the narratives. What do I mean by detailed information? History of repair and replacement. This is actually a great location when the manager tells me, hey, I just took over this property. I know nothing about it. Well, if that property has a reserve study, that may be a wealth of information to quickly familiarize yourself. Look in there, you would find, hypothetically, that the roofs were replaced in 2012. All of a sudden, you've gained a lot of knowledge just by looking in that reserve study. Or the condition statement. You expect that the reserve study is going to tell you to paint in 7 years. You get the study, and I'm saying paint next year, and it doesn't make sense to you. Well, look in those narratives. What did the conditions explain? If there's a near-term project, you absolutely should expect to see in the narratives, photos documenting those conditions, statements explaining what the reserve specialist saw that warrants this near-term, repair or replacement of this element. And then finally, on some items, there's going to be a little more detail. Our large expenditures, roofs, pavement, large mechanical systems, you'll probably get a little more explanation to what these projects are, compared to light fixtures. Like, we're not going to really expand upon the concept of what your light fixture is. That's relatively basic. But again, for these larger, more involved projects, you may have additional detail. I always want to drive home, this isn't design spec, or don't hand this to a contractor and say, go build this. This is more just, general information, helpful for you, potentially even more helpful for board members who have potentially zero background on anything construction. They don't know what repaving even means. And so you can just understand a little bit more about the projects and the elements. And, that's just breaking it down into 4 sections. There's a lot more there. As I said, that's a whole nother, hour discussion. But the most important thing to remember is the point of covering this today is to make you familiar, but keep the reserve specialist as the expert. When you have those questions, you should never hesitate to involve whoever provided you that study, involve them in those communications or discussions with your board, have them answer those questions because they're the expert. They're the one who actually compiled that study. So that's who you want to rely on for that. And with that, wrapped up a few minutes early. That's all I have for this. If there's any questions, you can either unmute or you can put them in the chat box. I'll sit here for a minute or two. But if not, thanks for sitting in today. Also, as I mentioned at the beginning, if you need CMCA continuing education credits, do chat. You can chat it privately, name, email address, and I'll issue those in the coming days. And there's a question, can the Excel spreadsheets be manipulated as some projects unexpectedly need to move forward and other projects may have the flexibility to push back? Very relevant question, especially right now with some uncertainty. And so, yeah, for us personally as a provider, and I think many providers, but I can speak to us definitively, yeah, when you get a study, we give you an Excel file. And it's actually even interactive. So not only can you move the projects, but as you move them, it updates your funding, not the recommendation, right, but the actual when the expenditure occurs. So let's go to the extreme. If you have to accelerate a project and you do that, you can see in the funding plan, oh, we're going to run out of money. Or maybe you accelerate a smaller project and you see financially your balance is lower, but you're still able to weather that. So yeah, you have that flexibility. You can even change unit cost or project costs. If in the study it's $1 million roof, and it's not that you need to change the timing, but you get a bid and it's going to be $1.2 million or it's going to be $800,000, you can make that change. And again, see the effects in the funding plan. Yeah, so good question. Any other questions? Okay, If not, I appreciate your time. Thanks for the opportunity here. Again, send me email and name if you do need your CMCA. Um, Otherwise, again, any questions? My name Andrew Stoutenberg. If you have questions, you can always email or call. It's really simple. It's Andrew@reserveadvisors.com. Reach out. Always happy to answer any questions, specific or general, and regardless of if it's a client of ours. Just always happy to talk and try to be that resource for you all. But thanks so much. Have a good rest of your week and weekend.